Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. Here on Broadcasting Scotland, I am Scott Bevan and I'm joined here today by regular contributor Andrew Wilson. Hello, Andrew.
Scott, good evening. It's great to be in this little box in the corner, and it's great to see you on the show this evening. How are you?
I am okay, yes. And now for the coronavirus update. As of 2 pm today, a total of 2,127,130 people in Scotland have been tested through NHS Scotland labs and UK Government regional testing centres since the start of the pandemic. Of these, 1,187,486 have been confirmed negative. 249,644 have tested positive. There are 1,129 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There is one new reported death of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by coronavirus COVID-19 infection now stands at 7,684. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 133 were in hospital last night, 15 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 am this morning, 3,551,739 people have received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 2,493,358 had received their second dose. Today's vaccination figures exclude data from GP systems from the 14th of June 2021. These will be included in tomorrow's figures. The latest UK daily figures show 127,926 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, an increase of 9 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just hospitals. The NRS update now. As of 13th of June, 10,137 deaths have been registered in Scotland where the novel coronavirus COVID-19 was mentioned on the death certificate. According to statistics published by National Records of Scotland today, in the week the 7th of June to the 13th of June, 7 deaths were registered that mention COVID-19 on the death certificate, a decrease of 1 death from the previous week. There were 2 deaths in South Lanarkshire and 1 death in each of Aberdeen City, City of Edinburgh, Eastern Bartonshire, Glasgow City and North Ayrshire. The number of deaths from all causes registered in Scotland in this week was 1,051, 8% more than the 5-year average for week 23. 93% of people dying with COVID had at least one pre-existing condition, the most common of which was dementia and Alzheimer's. Over the period of the pandemic, from March 2020 to May 2021, 186 males per 100,000 people have died with COVID-19 mentioned on their death certificates, compared with 128 females. In May of 2021, the death rate for deaths involving COVID-19 fell to 6 deaths per 100,000 people. On now to the sustainable economic recovery. An initial 25 projects designed to help meet skills needed in a range of sectors will receive a share of up to 20 million as part of the second phase of the National Transition Training Fund. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon made the announcement, which will benefit industries across Scotland from digital technology and social care to tourism, cybersecurity and construction. During a virtual meeting of the National Economic Forum, the NTTF was created to support people who have lost their job or are at risk of redundancy as a result of the pandemic. Since being established in October of 2020, it has helped over 6,000 individuals, and this second phase of funding has the potential to provide more than 20,000 additional training opportunities. The 20 million investment is targeted at sectors which need support to recover from the pandemic, to fill identified skills shortages, or which have a key role to play in future economic transitions, including to net zero. Projects include aircraft decommissioning training for workers in the aerospace sector, support for people looking to transition into the childcare and adult social care sectors, as well as workers within the sector looking to move into a different role or gain promotion, training for workers in cybersecurity to address skill gaps in the workforce, allowing those already in the sector to progress, and creating more entry-level positions for recruitment. Further support for the tourism and hospitality sector to address skills shortages and retain talent throughout investing in upskilling for future leaders. Upskilling and reskilling individuals in the construction sector with a focus on energy efficiency measures for older buildings. Transitioning people from industries affected by the pandemic into the screen sector, and more specifically, animation, special effects, and games businesses, which are growth sectors already increasingly hiring in Scottish creative businesses. So, Andrew, what do we think are the most important take-homes from this?
Well, Scott, I think this gives a good indication of the breadth of the opportunities that there are, and also the need for very broad thinking and very broad policies in terms of skilling and reskilling and rebuilding our economy and people's employment for the period as we begin to recover from the pandemic. The list of industries there was very interesting to me. We know that in the technology sector, there are always skill shortages, and we can never train enough people for tech businesses. But the potential change in priorities in our society, so more people caring for children, young people, and more people caring for adults, is an area that's going to have to be expanded and addressed, particularly if we move to introducing a national care service. I think hospitality is interesting too, especially post-Brexit and post-COVID. I know of hospitality businesses in eastern Scotland who have been unable to reopen 7 days a week because they cannot get enough staff, and so and that in the height of summer. So the need to be adding skills and to be training more people to work in those sectors, I think is clear. I think we've had a history of people working in the aviation industry with Rolls-Royce at East Kilbride, and at the refurbishment and repair work that's done principally at Prestwick. But I think with the move to potentially more space aviation as well, I think there are definitely will be demands for skills and experience and training in those areas. And so I think what we're seeing, I think it's, and the other thing I was going to say was in terms of the creative sectors and screen in particular, you mentioned animation, and I was struck yesterday, probably the leading animator who's been working in Scotland, the French animator Sylvain Chomet, who made The Illusionist, which was based in Edinburgh, amongst other things. He announced at the film festival in Annecy yesterday that he's making a new feature animated movie, and so I think with his close connections with animation in Dundee, and the creation of the greater use of studios in Glasgow and the introduction of the new studios in Edinburgh, I think that the list of projects and industries that you mentioned, I think, is pretty much spot on, and I'm looking forward to seeing what can be achieved quickly, because we are going to have to make progress there quickly. Possibly the only one that I was surprised that wasn't mentioned was perhaps brewing or maybe distilling, insofar as, of course, this week we've been told by Alistair Jack what huge opportunities there will be for exporting even more whisky to Australia. But putting that to one side for a minute, I think this breadth of industries and the breadth of the ambition is precisely what we need right now.
Absolutely. Perhaps the reason that whisky has not been included is the fact that whisky is not struggling the same as other industries. I think that It's very positive, certainly, what's come out of the creative industries over the past few years. And if they are struggling and they need help, then certainly it's good that the Scottish Government are taking that seriously now. We have up in Dundee, of course, we have Rockstar based, who have created, of course, the Red Dead Redemption and Grand Theft Auto franchises. So that's certainly something that we have going for us here in Scotland. Many people have raised in the hospitality sector and tourism sector uh, the threat that not only the pandemic has caused, and certainly that's caused an awful lot of problems for that industry, but also, as you mentioned, Brexit. Why do you think that Brexit is starting to have such a profound impact on that sector?
Scott, I think we've seen both across this sector and agricultural sectors already, and education as well. I think we've seen that seasonal workers or visitors who would travel to work in Scotland for a short period of time, or for only a year or so, they have largely not come back to Scotland this year. And I would suggest that that is entirely as a result of both the immigration policies and the working policies that have been introduced as part of the Brexit project. And so the lack of EU citizens who would come to work in Scotland over the summer, either in hospitality or in tourism generally, or in the agricultural sectors, I think there is widespread evidence of that already. It may have been shielded a little bit because so many of these hospitality businesses and tourism businesses have been closed, as you say, due to the pandemic. But now that they are reopening, the reality is starting to become clear, and that is that the workforce that we relied upon is not here this year.
Yep. So, with COVID financial support drying up, the SNP has warned that the UK government risks a wave of redundancies after it failed to extend key COVID financial support schemes following an extension of lockdown measures. Delivering the UK government's economic update in the House of Commons today, Steve Barclay, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, did not announce an extension to the furlough scheme, which is due to be scaled back from July the 1st. He also avoided filling the gaps in support that have left 3 million people without support through this crisis, and ignored calls to introduce a major fiscal stimulus. Commenting, the SNP's Shadow Chancellor, Alison Thewlis, MP, said, "Despite extending lockdown measures to tackle the pandemic, which will impact on businesses and workers, the UK government failed yet again to heed the calls to extend financial support schemes to help businesses and households in dire need." Ms. Thewlis said that the reality of refusing to extend the furlough scheme means risking a wave of redundancies. She said, "Businesses have been building up significant debt, and many can't afford the additional wage costs being forced on them by the UK government in the midst of further restrictions." So, Andrew, if furlough is not extended, how many redundancies do you think there are likely to be?
Well, I'm not going to put a number on that, Scott, but what I will say is that I think that the impact is likely to be very significant. A couple of things struck me in connection with this story. Firstly, we've seen over the past year that Downing Street and the Treasury are not always absolutely in lockstep. And so and I was surprised that Barclay didn't announce an extension of the furlough scheme and further financial support to businesses that are still being restricted. So I think we might see the Treasury adjust that announcement and come forward with something in due course. However, if they don't, and I should also say that I was a wee bit surprised that Barclay didn't announce an extension of the furlough scheme and further support, and I say that because the Treasury has come out relatively well from the Barney that's going on between Dominic Cummings and Matt Hancock and others. Cummings, I think, was at pains to be positive about the Treasury's response broadly. Maybe not eat out to help out, but in terms of the introduction of the furlough scheme, certainly he was very positive. So that the Treasury is stepping back from the warmth and applause is a wee bit of a surprise. And that then prompts me to think a little bit about Tory treasuries more generally, and Tory chancellors. I wonder whether this is now we're now starting to see the beginnings of the unmasking of Tory chancellors of old, or actually more importantly, those who now fund the Tory party, who may very well have an appetite for an economic crash. We know that in the kind of crash that is feared and that we need to protect against, that businesses will collapse, and so asset values will be distressed, and so asset for those who have plenty cash, the ability to pick up assets that then increase in value will be there, as in any economic downturn, particularly one that would be as acute and as widespread as what we would expect in the fallout from the pandemic. And also as a more general observation from those who fund the Tory party so generously now, particularly the hedge fund managers, we know that there is always a margin for them to be made in any distress situation or circumstances. And so I wonder whether we're either seeing we're seeing the fingerprints of those who are standing behind the Tory party and Boris Johnson and their agenda and their policies coming to the fore, or alternatively, I wonder if it's just a more traditional Tory approach, which is that they're not really that bothered about the situation of working people. And the situation of those who are least able to cope with economic shocks, and who will be hardest hit by economic shocks. We saw that was a very traditional approach as when I was younger, and I wonder whether that, after a year where we've seen very atypical policies from a Tory Treasury, now we're possibly returning to business as usual, which is picking on people who are least able to protect themselves.
Yes, parties have returned to business as usual, but people have not. The original date, of course, for the easing of all lockdown measures pretty much in England was supposed to be originally the 21st of June, and due to the Delta variant, this has been pushed back by at least 4 weeks. So if this is the case, then Alison Thulis is correct, isn't she? Businesses will fail to cope with this, and there will be redundancies. How are the government planning to sort of explain this away?
Well, I don't know that this government does much explaining nowadays. I've had the dubious pleasure, I've suffered a little bit watching Michael Gove doing the rounds on a number of news programmes today, when I've had a moment, and it's the same old, same old. It's deny and lie. And so I don't know that this government, on its track record, does very much in the way of explaining. But Alison Thulis is absolutely correct. And it is a surprise that we're not seeing the Treasury, in terms of the furlough schemes and business support, more in lockstep with the developments that there are in terms of COVID restrictions and COVID protections, and we should be pressurising the Treasury to make a clearer link, because, as you say, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are furloughed, and as we also know, businesses who have been supported to an extent by state support have at the same time continued to run up considerable debts. And in terms of their relationship with their commercial lenders, that is not an open-ended relationship, and so I think we're going to see businesses struggling more and more over the next month or 2 months, and that will require state intervention in one way or another, or else there will be a catastrophic economic collapse.
Living with COVID should mean improving sick pay. Following a Whitehall document outlining recommendations on how we can live with COVID, the SNP's health spokesperson, Dr. Philippa Whitford MP, has said this will only be possible if the UK government improves its sick pay policy. The document, which criticises the UK sick pay policy and urges UK ministers to do more to support people isolating, comes after a year of SNP calls to increase statutory sick pay in line with the real living wage. Make it available for 52 weeks instead of 28 weeks, and make it available to everyone regardless of earnings, working hours or contract. In November, the Resolution Foundation revealed that over 2 million people in the UK do not qualify for statutory sick pay. The UK has one of the lowest rates of sick pay in Europe, with the Council of Europe describing it as manifestly inadequate. Yet it is the main support available for employees who need to self-isolate during the coronavirus crisis. There seems to be a parallel here, does there not, between the lowest sick pay in Europe and also the lowest pensions in Europe and any kind of support for the poor and the vulnerable. Is this likely to be dealt with, do you think, within this Parliament by the UK government?
Well, your point's absolutely right, Scott. And the paucity of provision, both in terms of pensions and in sick pay, is an indication of what I think of what I was saying a moment ago, in terms of the Tory governments have a habit of extracting the pound of flesh from those who are least able to protect themselves, and in particular to prevent themselves from unexpected shocks such as illness. As we know, illness is not it's not an indulgence, and it's not an offence. And so nobody should be penalised, and the impact of illness should be shared across the community, because we never know when one of us is going to become ill. I would say more generally that Dr. Whitford is somebody who we should always listen very carefully to on matters such as this, such as her experience and her expertise. And the point that she makes is absolutely right. The provision of sick pay in the UK has always been very poor on any measure against European countries, and that continue, and that's in terms of the duration and in terms of the amount and other limitations, and so it always has been very poor. And so the opportunity with hopefully with beginning the pathway out of the pandemic, this is another opportunity to rebuild in terms of making sure that those who are least able to protect themselves against economic shocks or illness are better provided for, because that investment in them will pay dividends for society as a whole. If people are better able to cope with the economic shocks associated with illnesses, then they are better able to return to productive participation in society, whether that's working or not. I wasn't limiting it simply to being in employment, but to be productive participants in our society. And so the better we can support people in returning to being productive participants, then the better. And the current provision from Westminster has historically been very poor, but it continues to be so. And that got me thinking a little bit. We know that not all powers are devolved to Scotland, and in particular we know that as a result of the Smith Commission, any requests to devolve any aspects of employment law were refused. And so employment law generally is still reserved to Westminster. But given that we're talking here about sick pay and fundamentally about illness, I wonder whether we should begin to think about whether there might be some form of Scottish sick pay top up or approach in order to, and that whether that might be made under health legislation, which is of course devolved to Holyrood, and so whether there might be another opportunity for a Scottish government to open clear water between themselves and an austere Tory administration in Westminster, which picks on the poorest. And so I think I would certainly encourage the SNP and the Scottish Government to think about ways in which they could innovate and ways in which they might begin to address this concern, because I don't think that Westminster will do so. And so that refusal by Westminster should be turned to Scotland's political advantage.
Interesting points there from Andrew. To international news now. US President Joe Biden and Russian President Vladimir Putin agreed at their first summit on Wednesday to resume arms controls talks and to return ambassadors to each other's capitals after they were withdrawn earlier this year. The summit at the lakeside Villa Lagrange in Geneva lasted less than 4 hours, far less than Biden's advisors had said that they had expected. Putin, who was first to brief reporters, said the meeting had been constructive without hostility and had showed the leaders' desire to understand each other, He also said, Russia and the United States share the responsibility for nuclear stability and would hold talks on possible changes to the recently extended New START Arms Limitation Treaty. In the past hour, President Biden has stressed the importance of meeting in person, saying, all foreign policy is just a logical extension of human relationships. The US president said, I told Putin my agenda is not against Russia or anyone else, though he was keen to raise the issue of human rights abuses, which he said is always going to be on the table. The president laid out 16 levels of critical infrastructure to Mr. Putin, which he said must be off limits to any cyber interference, and discussed getting food to those in need in Syria and preventing Iran from obtaining functional nuclear weapons. The Kremlin leader said Washington and Moscow would start consultations on cybersecurity, adding that most cyber attacks on Russia came from the United States. President Biden will be holding the press conference as we speak. In fact, I think he has probably just finished. So I caught the press conference just before, well, the start of his questions, just before we came on air. It seemed as though Biden was able to talk to Putin in a way that perhaps we thought he might not be able to, since Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin seem to have such an accord on so many things, perhaps regrettably. But President Biden appears, at least from what we have heard, to have held his own and also to be developing a professional relationship with Vladimir Putin. Do you think this is a good thing for international relations going forward, Andrew?
Well, certainly one thing strikes me there, Scott. I've never heard the relationship between a puppet and a puppeteer as being called an accord, because that's very clearly what the situation was between President Putin and President Trump. I think all of the evidence from any of their meetings made it absolutely, and including Trump saying that he preferred evidence and information from the Russian secret services than from the CIA. And so that was a very close accord between Trump and Putin, and that, I think, thankfully, is now at an end. I think the relative shortness of the discussions today, and the White House, I think, had trailed them as expecting them to take 4 or 5 hours, and they took about 3 and a bit, I think. I think that probably reflects the tentative nature of beginning to re-engage in a more reasonable and sensible and pragmatic and diplomatic manner. And that's because those engagements tend to have a stronger foundation, but also they take a bit more work. I'm reminded that when Trump met Putin, they eventually at one point met with only interpreters in the room, so there were no notes taken, and none of the usual toolkits and nuts and bolts that go with those kind of high level discussions. So I think there was an element from the US in particular of setting the ground rules again, starting again from scratch, and doing this sort of thing properly. And I think that probably gives that should be helpful in terms of making progress in the course of future discussions. And it also reflects, I think, that in sharp contrast to Trump, Biden is an experienced international statesman. He was vice president for 8 years, and he was a senior politician for decades before that. And so he will be returning to a more organized and practical and professional way of conducting business. And also, I think that I was certainly reflecting the contrast between Trump's meetings with Putin, and I was also comparing today with Reagan's meetings with Gorbachev in the 1980s. Certainly, the scenes of the press pack today in Geneva were very redolent of the press pack's behaviour when Gorbachev met Reagan in Reykjavik and in Geneva, back when I was a great deal younger and had more hair. So I think there is perhaps a return to more serious politics, international politics, which is not intended to focus entirely on the bank accounts of those participating in it. I include President Putin and President Trump and his family, in what I'm saying there. So a move away from being focused really only on property developments and the behaviour of oligarchs is a good thing. And I think the focus on critical infrastructure, I think we'll probably talk about critical infrastructure again later on in this programme perhaps, but I think we have seen, not necessarily even for reasons related to interference from foreign actors, we have seen the relative shakiness of elements of the US's critical infrastructure. We have seen attacks on critical infrastructure in Europe over the last few years, and I think Biden calling that out reflects both the seriousness of the situation, but also a determination to deal with it. That will require investment, in particular in the US, and it will require the Russian state actors who are involved heavily in those activities to be reined in, either by Putin or by threats from the US, or if not threats, then an explanation that if they carry on behaving in the manner in which they have been behaving, then there will be serious ramifications. So I think that bringing that to light is important. And I think, and to return to my original point, which is about after the Trump mafia family having control of the wheel for a few years, a return to those who are concerned with things other than their own bank balances. It was also reflected by the commitment that I think was suggested today that the US and Russian ambassadors will return to their official residencies in the state capitals of the opposite countries, and that restoration of normal diplomacy, that restoration of the ability to communicate, I think that is also a good sign, and especially in circumstances where we are going to be the international diplomacy is going to be taxing for the next few years as the Biden administration seeks to undo the damage that's been done over the past 4 years, and so that, as well as speaking softly and carrying an appropriately sized stick, and also speaking plainly and clearly on matters of importance, it also needs the face-to-face communication that we saw today between the two presidents, but we will also see between the State Department and the Russian ambassador and the Russian equivalent of the State Department and America's ambassador in Moscow. So I think significant signs of hope, perhaps, of a restoration of business as usual.
Yes, Biden was keen to present an image of strength. He said that Russia are not able to dictate what happens in the world, and also said there must be some basic rules of the road that we can all abide by. He stressed the idea that America are uniquely a product of an idea. It seems as though he was trying to sell President Putin on the idea of American democracy and why it is that they think the way that they think. Do you think that Putin's listening to any of that?
I think he will be listening. As a former KGB officer, a great deal of his training is about listening and then analysing, but listening is the first step. So I think he will be listening. I think he will be testing what he's heard and will be analysing it very closely. And I think the events continue to evolve. It's not the case that Putin can in any way control what happens on the planet. So he needs to be in a position where his foreign policy and his agendas are able to flex. And so I think we will definitely see a change. I think it may be important for Biden to demonstrate the benefits that there are to Russia and to the Russian people, as opposed to the President Putin himself, the benefits of a working relationship between the two countries in the style that we saw previously, not the sort of working relationship that we saw under Trump. And so I think if the positive benefits to the people of Russia can be demonstrated, by which I mean greater peace, greater security, and greater opportunities, then I think there is a hope that we might make some progress. And I think President Putin will be listening to that message.
Moving on to domestic matters again now then. The First Minister has put forward Dorothy Bain QC and Ruth Chartres QC to be appointed as the new Scottish law officers. If Parliament approves the nominations, Miss Bain will take up the position of Lord Advocate, replacing James Wolfe QC, who will demit office once Her Majesty has signed the warrant appointing his successor. Miss Charteris will become the new Solicitor General for Scotland, succeeding Alison de Rollo QC. If successful, the appointments will mark the first time both posts have been held by women simultaneously. The appointments will be made by the Queen on the recommendation of the First Minister with the agreement of the Scottish Parliament. Mr. Wolfe informed the First Minister last year that he intended to leave office following the recent election and confirmed his intention before the re-election as First Minister of Nicola Sturgeon. Ms de Rollo also confirmed her intention to stand down following this year's election. Do you think then, Andrew, that these are positive moves? Certainly the first two females to hold the post simultaneously, that has to be something that will go down slightly in history.
Yes, I think these are entirely positive moves, Scott. I think it's not a complete surprise that the law officers change when a new government comes into power. That's happened before and is, in a sense, is to be expected. So I'm not surprised at that. However, both of these candidates, who we hope are nominated and we hope are appointed, both these candidates are excellent candidates. Dorothy Bain in particular has shown throughout her career that she is one who is able to demonstrate that the legal profession has changed and continues to change and to trailblaze. She was the first female principal advocate depute in Scotland, so a very senior prosecutor. And I think that the appointment of both Dorothy Bain and the Solicitor the new Solicitor, the nomination for appointment of the new Lord Advocate and new Solicitor General indicates as well how the law profession has changed. I started law school in '86, and my year was the first year where the majority of first years were female. Now it's taken, as you can tell by my age, it's taken a while to get to the stage where we hope we'll have a female Lord Advocate, but we've got there. So I think that's a positive indication as well. Notwithstanding the gender aspect of it, I think it's absolutely clear that Dorothy Bain will be an outstanding Lord Advocate. She has a very broad experience throughout her career. In civil practice, she started as a solicitor at Dundas and Wilson as a civil court lawyer. Then in criminal practice, especially at the bar, she led the prosecution of Patrick Tobin for the murder of Angelica Klook, and was fundamental in the creation of the National Sex Crime Unit within the Crown Office. And so she's been very involved in criminal practice. But she also, when she's been at the bar, she's had a very important public law practice as well. For example, she was instructed by Just Right in the judicial review petition, which looked at the definition of woman in the Public Board Scotland Act 2018. And Miss Bain wrote an opinion for an intervener in that case. So I think that she is a supremely qualified lawyer. She has worked in the Crown Office for many years and has had a number of appointments, both within the Crown Office and more broadly. She was on the Equalities and Human Rights Commission for several years, for example. And so I think she will be she'll be an extremely good Lord Advocate. And that's whether or not that she's a woman, but the fact that she is a woman is important as well. And I think I'm looking forward to seeing the signs of her advice and her assistance to the government as it negotiates difficult circumstances, both in terms of legislation, and I'm thinking in particular with regard to any referendum bill that might be proposed in the Scottish Parliament, but also in terms of any updating of the system of administration of justice in Scotland, which is felt to be necessary. The dual role of the Lord Advocate became a football, or I'll not go with that. Well, a football that was kicked onto the park by Mr. Salmond, who himself had recognised before that the dual role of the Lord Advocate wasn't an ideal set of circumstances, but hadn't done very much about it when he was First Minister. But now that the matter has come up, is much further up the list of political priorities, I think someone like Dorothy Bain as Lord Advocate will be a great asset to the Scottish Government in making progress in addressing the concerns that were raised with regard to the position of the Lord Advocate.
The Scottish Greens say we are unprepared for climate breakdown. The UK and Scottish governments are not doing enough to adapt to rising temperatures and increasing extreme weather events because of climate breakdown, senior climate advisors have warned. A new report from the Climate Change Committee warns policies are failing to keep pace with increased climate risks, which will happen even if the world successfully brings emissions down. These risks include to power supply and infrastructure, crops, livestock, habitats, soil quality, and natural carbon stores like forests and peatlands. The report also warns that climate change is likely to widen inequalities. Launching the report, CCC Chief Executive Chris Stark said there was no clear evidence that climate risks or opportunities for agriculture and forestry are being strategically managed across the UK. Commenting, Scottish Greens co-leader Lorna Slater said this report is crystal clear that both the UK and Scottish governments have failed to take action to adapt to the rising temperatures and extreme weather events that threaten our way of life. It warns that opportunities to get this right are time limited, which is why resilience and sustainability needs to be at the heart of plans for economic recovery. So this is surely the greatest challenge that our generation, and by our generation I do mean everyone here on the planet, faces. Why is it that the Scottish Government are not doing enough, especially when they have had climate change targets in place for the past few years that have said that we're going to tackle a lot of things that have yet to be tackled?
Well, that's a very good question, Scott. I think today's report is important, not least because we know that the CCC is independent of any government, and so I think they should be listened to very, very closely. I think the realization of the risks that are posed by not just by climate change, that's obvious, but the risks that are posed by the collision of climate change and inequality, I think that's possibly only really been drawn into sharp focus as a result, perhaps, of the pandemic. And so I think the prospect, again, of those who are least able to protect themselves against economic shock and perhaps climate shock, I think the risk that section of our society are the most seriously affected, and as a result are those who make their dissatisfaction felt in the most direct manner. I think that's maybe slightly starting to dawn on politicians. The Scottish Government has, as you say, pursued a green agenda from time to time, and I think it's becoming apparent that for whatever has been done, more needs to be done, and immediately. And so I think we'll see green policies becoming a more green policies in a more informed and thoughtful and direct manner as the crisis continues to grow. I'm thinking a little bit of the way in which CalMac were attempting to procure dual fuel ferries in an attempt to be green, and how badly that went. And in contrast, Norway has launched an electric ferry this afternoon. And so I think there's a need to cut to the chase in the Scottish Government and to focus more clearly on those things. And ferries are a slightly obtuse example, but we were speaking before about critical national infrastructure. We can see that, for example, from America, that critical national infrastructure, and I'm thinking of the power supply network in Texas, cannot now cope with winters, and we're seeing this week it cannot now cope with the summer either. And so that's an example in the United States. However, critical national infrastructure everywhere needs to be made as resilient as possible in order to address the threats the clear and present threats that the climate crisis brings. And so we need to focus on that too. And infrastructure is largely, if not exclusively, but largely devolved to Holyrood. I know that there has been talk this week of the proposed construction of a massive new hydroelectric scheme on Loch Ness. But in terms of making our critical national infrastructure more robust and more resilient, that needs to be a priority, and I would like to see the government doing more in that area in particular.
Most of the parties at the recent election attempted in some way, at least, to sort of greenwash their manifestos. Do you think that some form of cooperation, coalition, call it what you like, with the Scottish Green Party could ensure that action is stepped up on some of these things?
I think it has every prospect of that, and I think that's a good thing. I think the Greens have made it clear that have made it clear in the past that that's the way in which they operate. They made it clear during the election, and the overtures and preliminary discussions which apparently have taken place, I think undoubtedly will have focused on that. And I think that probably in the sense of thinking about the climate crisis, that potentially plays well for both parties. It increases the focus that the SNP need to give to the climate, but it also means that a little bit uh, of the Greens, the Green Party reflects well on the SNP and the Scottish government because they are so focused on the climate crisis. So I think there's a potential benefit for both parties in there, and I'm certainly hopeful that we see green policies being implemented quickly by any coalition or cooperation agreement that's
Yeah.
put in place.
The UK government then has rebuked Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister Leo Varadkar for saying he believed there could be a united Ireland within his lifetime. Brandon Lewis, the Northern Ireland Secretary, told the Commons on Wednesday the comments were unhelpful and ill-advised. The blunt remark came amid a fresh effort to defuse a political row in Northern Ireland that threatens to collapse its power-sharing government. Lewis is to meet the region's party leaders in Belfast later on Wednesday to discuss an impasse over Irish language legislation that has hobbled the executive and could trigger early elections. Sinn Féin wants the British government to bypass the executive and assembly at Stormont and to pass the legislation at Westminster. But some unionist leaders have warned London not to intervene. The language row has aggravated tension over a separate flashpoint, the post-Brexit Irish Sea border. That has fueled loyalist street protests and rancour between London and Brussels. Varadkar made a pointed intervention on Tuesday night in Dublin when he told the annual conference of his Fine Gael party that both sides of the island could be united within his lifetime. We should be proud to say that unification is something we aspire to, he said. It should be part of our mission as a party to work towards it. We can do so in many ways. Unification must not be the annexation of Northern Ireland. It means something more. A new state designed together. A new constitution, and one that reflects the diversity of a binational or multinational state in which almost 1 million people are British, like the new South Africa, a rainbow nation, not just orange and green. Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister said the views of unionists must be understood and respected, but that no one group had a veto on Ireland's future. He said Fine Gael may start to organise, but not contest elections in Northern Ireland. This is a very interesting development, isn't it, Andrew? The fact that we now have the Irish government essentially saying that Irish reunification is not only possible but likely to happen within the next couple of decades.
Well, I think that's right, Scott. It firstly strikes me that to use Brandon Lewis's own words, I think having Brandon Lewis as Northern Ireland Secretary is unhelpful and ill-advised, and we see that every day, especially in the ongoing rancour with the EU and with Stormont in connection with the Northern Ireland Protocol, which Brandon Lewis and Boris Johnson negotiated and signed and ran an election on the basis of, and are now complaining about and are saying they're going to step away from. So I think having this Tory administration involved is ill-advised and unhelpful. I think for Dr. Varadkar to be talking about the reunification of Ireland at a Fine Gael party conference is to be expected, and to suggest anything else is daft. He was using exactly the sort of language I would expect to hear a Deputy Prime Minister use at a party conference in Dublin. Firstly, in terms of talking in positive terms about the future of the island of Ireland, and also in terms of party politics, having a view to Sinn Féin. We know that Sinn Féin are continuing to make advances in politics in the Republic of Ireland, and undoubtedly they are threatening the cosy hegemony between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil that's existed for a very long time. And so I think Dr. Varadkar is talking to soft Sinn Féin voters in an effort to woo them to his cause. And so again, I wouldn't be to be suggesting that anyone's surprised by him saying these things is just plain daft.
It's
I think
interesting, I think, as well, that the Conservative government have come out and said that he should tone down his rhetoric, but not suggested in any way that this is not for the Irish people to decide, or that it's not going to happen, as they have tried to do, of course, here in Scotland.
Yeah, I think Dr. Varadkar's remarks are entirely consistent with the approach that's being taken by the EU, and that has probably annoyed the Downing Street over the weekend, especially with the way in which everybody else that was in Cornwall lined up against the UK's attempted approach to the Northern Ireland Protocol, and I think it's and also the reflection of the difficulties that the Tory government's approach has now led to in Stormont, with the Assembly now again being under threat of collapse, because no proper effort has been put into seeking to find a solution to the serious challenges that there are, both in terms of people and in terms of policies, and so the lack of attention that's been paid to Northern Ireland, I think, is typical. And I think, actually, on reflection, I think Dr. Varadkar's praying in aid of the rainbow nation of South Africa is probably, I don't doubt for a second he means it honestly, but I think that's probably trolling the Tory party as well, bearing in mind the Tory party's long historical support for apartheid and a segregated South Africa that was nothing of a rainbow nation at all.
Yes, June the 21st has been slated as the date in which they need to have a deal by.
That's right.
More than 7 out of 10 children in early learning and childcare are now receiving the full 1,140 funded hours. The number of children has risen by 10,510 since February, an increase from 65% to 72%. The latest data from the Improvement Service shows that at the end of April 2021, 118,068 children were accessing funded early learning provisions. Of these, 102,410 children, 87%, were accessing more than the statutory entitlement of 600 hours, and 84,606 children, 72%, were accessing the 1,140 hours. This is good news. 30 hours a week, that is, of childcare. It certainly helps myself and my partner and many other people across this country.
I completely agree, Scott. I think well, there's two things. I think this is another indication of the matrix of policies that were set out in the SNP's manifesto at the last Scottish election. And I think these are the policies that certainly struck me at the time as being, if I can use the word, a matrix, by which I mean, obviously, this policy is focused on young people, and we know that investment in young people always pays huge dividends for society as a whole, and so any money and time and effort spent in that direction is the right thing to do. However, this investment in young people also helps young families and young working families. And so the benefits are not just focused on the young people themselves, although the benefits to the young people are considerable. It also benefits families in work and are seeking work or in education. And so this is to be applauded and to be expanded. The more we can have of the implementation of these policies quickly, the better.
Yes, you can get free childcare if you are studying from the ages of 1 and 2, when they are very, very young children. But of course, if you aren't, then it's very, very difficult to get that provision in place. Do you think that something perhaps will be done there at some stage?
Well, yes, I think, I think what I would like to see, or what I would hope to see, is in the same way as the introduction of a national care service for caring for adults, an expansion of caring for young people and their families at the other end of the age spectrum, but but with a similar benefit and similar purpose in mind. I think that that would be a good thing, and so the broadening and the deepening of provision of care for young people and support for young families I think is an important mirror or balance to the establishment of a national care service and caring for citizens who are a great deal older than those who haven't yet started primary education.
NHS healthcare now. New measures to provide free NHS healthcare to all young people aged 18 to 25 have been introduced at the Scottish Parliament today. This is for dental care. Amendments to the regulations which cover the cost of NHS dental care will mean around 600,000 young people will benefit from free dental care from the end of August, subject to parliamentary approval. In a letter to the dentist, Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf said the oral health of young people often suffers as they move out of the family home, away from the supervision of parents for the first time. I am also particularly mindful of the disproportionate economic impact of the pandemic on our young people. That is why we now are going even further than our original commitment to remove dental charges for care experienced young people within 100 days of this government, and widening this out to include all 16 to 25-year-olds. This is a huge thing, isn't it, Andrew? I mean, this is the one thing that seemed to be missing from our NHS is free dental care. And it's something that the SNP have agreed that they want universally, but they are going to start with 16 to 25-year-olds, and hopefully that will continue during the course of this Parliament.
Well, that's right, Scott. I'm very old, but I'm not quite old enough to remember the fight that there was when the NHS was established in England and Wales, and dentistry was carved out. And so but I certainly agree that we need to address that apparent inconsistency and bringing dental care within Scotland properly within the NHS and free at the point of delivery is a necessity. But also, again, in terms of there being a matrix of policies that were laid out in the manifesto by the SNP, focusing this aspect on the health of young people and the health of our population generally, but focusing the implementation first on young people says a great deal, I think. And we know that, as I said before, any investment in the health and well-being of young people pays huge dividends, both in the short term and the long term. We know that regular dental care is important, for example, in spotting the development of cancer. And so in a country that has very high rates of cancer of all sorts, the bringing young people into a dental care system that is free to them at the point of delivery then is an important improvement in the general health of the population over the long term. So yes, this is a big improvement both in terms of the immediate benefit for young people, but also in terms of a general improvement in the health and well-being of our population as a whole.
And finally, an investment of around 20 million in 10 surgical robots will result in less invasive procedures and boost hospital capacity across Scotland. The robotic assisted surgery system procured by National Services Scotland (NSS) will be used primarily for cancer treatment, including urological, colorectal and gynecological operations. The surgical robots will be based in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, NHS Lothian, NHS Tayside, NHS Grampian, NHS Fife, NHS Golden Jubilee and NHS Highland. These new robotic systems will be predominantly used for cancer surgery. They're able to access hard-to-reach areas of the body, such as the pelvis, the chest, the oral cavity, and allowing surgeons to undertake precise and complex cancer surgery while avoiding making large wounds. These systems have more advanced capabilities than others and will help NHS Scotland continue to deliver world-class, minimally invasive cancer research services across the country. That is us for this evening. Thank you for joining us. I am Scott Bevan, and thank you very much to Andrew Wilson for joining us today. We can only deliver the services that we provide to the Scottish public here with your help and support. Of course, some of that has to be financial in order for us to continue the work that we do. So if you have any capacity to help us in any way, then please do consider it. Thank you very much and good night.
How do you mean no more commission?
Well, no one in Scotland can commission an idea. You know, if I went to BBC Scotland and I said, oh, I've got this great idea for a sitcom, I've got this brilliant idea for a drama, you know, there isn't one person in Scotland that can okay it unless it goes through London.
Good morning and welcome to another edition of Full Scottish. What's happening today?
Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
That need, that desire for independence is ever stronger than perhaps it was in 2014. So there's an obligation that we've got to give leadership to that campaign. That's what Nicola Sturgeon, as our First Minister, has been doing.
My feeling about Boris Johnson is he can't be trusted on anything.
That is now and forever will be known as the rape clause.
I'm old enough to remember going into Europe in '73, and I remember how much of a razor's edge that was a battling stone. And I think we made it by 53%, if I remember correctly, for going in. And ever since that time, England particularly has been pretty much schizophrenic, down the middle about whether it felt British or whether it felt European. And that schism, that crack has remained throughout English society ever since.
Scotland means business. Scotland's voice won't be stilled, it won't be silenced, it has to be heard.
About the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.